Irlandezii au câștigat simpatia lumii prin felul lor de a fi și de a petrece, în special de ziua Sfântului Patrick. Am ales ca decor pentru o discuție despre ce credem noi că înseamnă Irlanda și cum este ea de fapt, cel mai vechi pub irlandez deschis în București. Ambasadorul Paul McGarry ne-a răspuns cu mult umor la întrebări despre castele bântuite, literatura profundă, dar și distileriile de whisky din țara lui. În plus, am stabilit că Irlanda rămâne cu fantomele, iar România cu vampirii, ca să avem fiecare câte o nișă turistică. Sunt Cristina Cileacu. Începe Pașaport Diplomatic. Ambassador Paul McGarry, the Ambassador of Ireland, welcome to Diplomatic Passport again.
Thanks, Christina. I'm delighted to be here.
You have a green tie, I'm wearing a green scarf, so we're definitely talking about the St. Patrick's Day. This week Ireland is celebrating, of course, the famous saint, nation patron, who ironically wasn't born Irish.
St. Patrick was born in Wales, and it was at a time when, like now, there was a lot of traffic between Ireland and Wales. Now, in those days, it wasn't such a healthy traffic. He was captured as a slave and he was brought to Ireland as a slave. So it was in, I think, the 5th century, and obviously he had a very difficult time in Ireland when he arrived. He tended animals in the north of Ireland, and he was in Ireland for 6 years, and then he had a vision, had a dream that there was a ship waiting for him on the south coast, so he made his way there, and he made his way eventually, after some trials and tribulations, back to his family. And of course after that he was driven by Christianity, and he was driven by his mission to bring Christianity to the Irish people. And the Irish people took to that vision with gusto. So he became a really important part of Irish folklore and Irish myth, and lots of miracles have been attributed to Patrick, but he really has become part of our identity. And I think it speaks to a lot of what we believe in now, not just the Christianity piece, but the piece about somebody coming to our shores in very difficult circumstances, and actually coming back and wanting to give and contribute something to the Irish nation.
Well, ironically, again, but the biggest parades of St. Patrick's Day, of course not now in the time of the pandemics, are not in Ireland, but rather in the United States, where actually in the 18th century was the first parade of St. Patrick's Day. How come, explain to us this phenomenon, how come everyone more or less becomes Irish when it's to celebrate St. Patrick's Day? Because this celebration happens as well in Romania, and we are not exactly Irish here.
Well, this speaks to a kind of difficult part of our history. We have a history of immigration, and we have a history of immigration going way back, back really to the 17th century, the 1600s, 1700s. And 1800s. Before the famine, which took place in 1845 to 49, there was bits before and after the really terrible death and destruction. Immigration was prevalent in Ireland. 1.5 million people left Ireland after 1815. So immigration was part of what we were, and people immigrated. The people who emigrated were very poor, and they weren't welcomed with open arms everywhere they went. It was a very difficult time. So they really celebrated St. Patrick's Day to identify themselves as Irish. And St. Patrick's Day parades and the St. Patrick's Day celebrations is something really that was given to us at home by our diaspora. And during all of those years of immigration, Irish people immigrated all over the world, not just to the United States and to the United Kingdom, but to South America, to Australia, to all over. So I think our diaspora now is spread all over the world, and we have, I think, up to 70 million people worldwide who claim Irish extraction. So we're very grateful to our diaspora.
In the 19th century, since you're talking about immigration, the Irish people were discriminated in the United States. They were I don't know, stereotypes as being violent and alcoholic. There are a lot of problems, but then again, they turn to be quite strong. And today, for instance, Joe Biden, the actual American president, is very proud of its Irish roots. How did the Irish manage to turn themselves from being discriminated to being such important in the world politics?
Well, when Irish people immigrated initially, it was generally people who were uneducated, who wanted to work hard, but who didn't have either the capital or the education to walk into good jobs when they arrived. So they generally did the jobs that other people didn't want, but they organised themselves, particularly in America, and they tended to go in for jobs in first and second generation that were state jobs. So a lot of them ended up working in the fire service, in the police service, in the administrative systems. And they also organised themselves politically, and it was very well known that they took over the New York administration as well as other administrations, and they were the dominant figures in those administrations, in that type of administration. So they always had a place in politics, in those kind of service jobs, but they also went into business later on. When they did accumulate wealth, they did go into business, and they became very prominent in business. So I think today we remember what it was like for immigrants when they first arrived in the countries that they went to. And we do remember the kind of discrimination and the difficult times that they had and the types of things that they had to do to survive. So I think we do generally have a great sympathy for people who do immigrate from their countries. Now today immigration is much different for an awful lot of countries because generally now people who emigrate are the educated people rather than the uneducated. There's a mixture of everything, but that tends to be the case as well. And that happened to Ireland much later on, where our educated people left in the 60s, 70s and 80s.
Well, the world literature is as well in depth to Ireland, because you had what we call the four Dubliners. I'm talking about Oscar Wilde, William Butler Yeats, Samuel Beckett and James Joyce. They all inspired on the Dublin city, and they wrote about individuality, about isolation, about loneliness. So what is the true nature of Irish people? Because we have this balance of the dark side and, let's say, the joyful side.
That's a very good way of describing it, because I think in a lot of our literature and a lot of our film and culture there is a dark and there is a light. I think when you talk about those writers in particular, Joyce and Wilde and Shaw, and Bram Stoker was part of that time as well, you're talking about a time in Irish history that was incredibly difficult. That was where Ireland was coming out of the famine, and they wrote at that period that was essentially British rule in Ireland at that time was not a good thing for Ireland. And they talk about a people who are repressed. All of those writers were of the Anglo-Irish class. They were of the class that was Protestant and that wasn't Catholic and nationalist. Mm-hmm. But they were all people who wanted and believed in an Irish self-government, and they recognised themselves these dichotomies within Ireland and the fact that a people were suppressed and repressed. And I think that was a very important part, because Wilde really talks about being an outsider, and that is a lot of partially to do with his sexuality and the times he lived in where sexuality was very repressed. But he spoke as an outsider. Joyce and Dubliners is really about a repressed city. And Shaw, of course, gave the word Shavian to the English language. I mean, he had a view of the world that was very different to the prevailing view at the time. So all of these people had this connection to repression. But there has always been this piece in Irish literature, again, around Flann O'Brien and later on, where there is a joy and a madness kind of at the same time. The Third Policeman is one of the most wonderful books I think that was ever written, and I think everybody should read it, but it really is a very strange view, a very surreal view of life and the world. So I think you do have this kind of oddness, and I think that prevails a lot of our literature and film.
Since we, of course, talk about the Irish culture, I know one thing about the Irish people: they love to sing and dance. And the national symbol of your country is the harp. So what's the story behind it?
Well, many years ago, in the Celtic tradition, which is around poetry and music, and there were special schools. This goes way back into kind of the late first millennium, where people studied music, and particularly poetry. And then they went out into the world and they went to the local lords, and they became part of that, I wouldn't say feudal, medieval scene of music. This was the culture that was prevailed at the time. So that kind of wandering minstrel role really was there as part of our tradition up to the 1700s. And the symbol of that is the harp, because they travelled, the travelling musicians brought the harp. It was portable and it was what they used. So the harp is our symbol, and it really is a cultural symbol, and it's a symbol of music, and it is a very important part of our culture.
Romanians know, and the entire world, I should say, know very well the Lord of the Dance, which is a famous show inspired by Irish traditional dancing. So I have to ask you, Ambassador, do you know how to step dance?
I have to say no. Unfortunately. River dance, which really began this explosion of interest in Irish dance, it was a slight adaptation, but the steps are all Irish. But the format was different and new. And I remember watching that on the Eurovision, and I think it was 1994 Eurovision, and it was in Dublin. And Michael Flatley, of course, stepped out, and they were absolutely fantastic. And I think they inspired a generation of Irish people towards dance. But I'm afraid I was slightly before that, and our generation was certainly not. Girls used to do Irish dancing, boys did not, and that was the tradition of our time. But so unfortunately I didn't go there.
Ireland is unofficially known as the Emerald Island, and Johnny Cash had a famous song saying that the name comes from the 40 shades of green that the island of Ireland has. But it's also something, let's say, mystical, occult in this country, because you have a country, a lot of stories of fairies, leprechauns, pots of gold, witches, and so on and so forth. How come this mysticism started over there, or was born over there?
I think you have to experience Ireland actually to understand that, because it comes from the landscape, the atmosphere, the weather, the whole thing of being in Ireland, particularly at night time, and particularly in those times. There are things in Ireland called, we call them fairy forts. They're prehistoric. They come from a time when Ireland has had, I think it was in 3000 BC that this place called Newgrange was built. And Newgrange is a place that is really mystical, and it is in County Meath, and people can visit it. But it was built in, I think, 3000 BC, and the one thing that is really unique about it is that in one day of the year, a ray of light, the shortest day of the year, a ray of light penetrates the inner chamber of Newgrange. So around Ireland at that time, there were these things that were built, and essentially they were for storage of food and that type of thing, and they were called souterrains. And you'll find them everywhere. You'll find them almost in every town and village, and they're fairy forts. That's what we call them. And I think what happened was, also the wind in Ireland is very special, and the dark, especially winters. It doesn't get too cold so people can be out, so you don't have freezing temperatures, but you have cold temperatures. And it gets dark early, and the wind is very strong. We get Atlantic winds. So you get the wind, you get the souterrains that are all around, and people think there are people living in them, and there's this mystical thing of the little people. And you have a whole phenomenon that comes into people's minds. And I would have to say as well that people used to drink in the old days, and if you were cycling home after going to the pub on a dark, windy night, you would have all sorts of things going through your mind. And I think part of that, I think the banshee comes from the Irish wind, because you get a wind that is quite unique and extraordinary in its own way.
But why is female the banshee?
Oh, well, there is also this tradition of death, and how we manage death and how we respect death. And this comes back, and part of this, it's interesting that our tradition of Gothic horror, which is where Bram Stoker came from, and there was another very famous Gothic writer at the time, Sheridan Le Fanu. They came out of the writing of that period of the late 19th century, and it was a time when death was all around, and where you had this, and we had just survived the famine, or not survived the famine. So there was this thing of death, and really, I think that part of it, I mean, death being female, I think maybe the howling wind and the pitch of the tone, that would have been resonant with people. But yes, there is a mysticism there in the landscape and in the language, I think.
Since you mentioned Bram Stoker, of course, we owe him Dracula. He made us famous, more or less. But we have to say that the Irish people kept the ghost from themselves and let Romania to have the vampires. How is the tourism when it comes to the haunting castles of Ireland?
I think we do have a festival later in the year. Normally, I think it's around November, because that Samhain festival, that tradition of Samhain and Halloween, as we call it today, was a Celtic tradition. We do have this festival in Dublin later in the year, which is devoted to Gothic and Gothic horror. So, and we do have, I mean, you would have to say that many of the castles in Ireland do resonate with this type of feeling, and it is part of why people go to Ireland as well. So it is part of our tourism sale as well, I would have to say.
Another topic that our countries have in common, besides Bram Stoker and Dracula, is the curse habit, because Irish people curse, Romanian people curse, so we prefer the curses, or in the old times, let's say, people prefer more the curses and less the swearing. What is the history behind this habit?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from language again. The Irish language was very rich in descriptions, and it was very rich in the way people express themselves, this kind of not coming at something in a very straight line. We tend to go around things, and we come to things at angles. Now, partly, I think, this had to do, again, with our history, and it had to do with how we coped and survived being a people that were not in control of their own destiny. So there was this thing of coming at things in an indirect way, and then, but still having to express what you felt about somebody and what you wanted to happen to them. So a lot of the time it was a curse that would affect the fate of somebody. So it wasn't in one or two words, it was in very many words.
Well, we are filming this program in an Irish pub. It's easy to spot where we are. So I have to ask, of course, about the whiskey distilleries and the famous Guinness, which people usually drink, especially on St. Patrick's Day.
Well, I would have to say this is... it's great to be here, and it's lovely to be at an Irish pub in Bucharest. It's very unfortunate that it's empty apart from ourselves.
It's only for ourselves.
It's only for ourselves, and the pubs are not open.
And no Guinness.
And there's no Guinness and no drink. But Ireland's tradition of brewing and distilling is very old. I think the Guinness tradition is around the 1730s, 1700s anyway. But there were always many breweries, both in Dublin, in Cork, Kilkenny, right around the country. And that brewing tradition was very strong, and it has to do with brewing has to do with the crops that we grow, and distilling similarly, the grain of the barley.
Well, Ambassador, in this optimistic note, allow me to wish you a happy St. Patrick's Day, and may the people of Ireland be merry and happy.
And we wish the same to you, Cristina, and to everyone in Romania. Thank you very much.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de Twitter. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe, vineri de la 11:30 și în reluare sâmbătă de la 22:30. La revedere!